Senator Warner has joined us, so let me introduce him as he makes his way up here. He represents Mason's home state of Virginia, and he was elected to the Senate in 2008, before which he had served as the governor of Virginia between 2002 and 2006. He's also a former co-founder of Nextel, I understand, and he's known to tell people to leave their phones on, but actually for his talks, we would like you to make sure that you get your phones silenced. Senator Warner serves on multiple committees in the Senate, including the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, the Committee on Budget, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and the Joint Economic Committee. So without saying any further, Senator Warner, thank you for coming. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. I apologize on the front end for being late. But first of all, let me ask, how many of y'all live in Virginia? Wasn't it an extra bad commute this morning? Did you read about the sinkhole on Edsel Street that ended up making the Parkway traffic worse than ever? So I apologize, but hopefully a little bit of understanding in terms of the delay. I like to, in normal crowds, particularly folks that are not from Virginia, go through a quick litany as the former governor of Virginia, all the designations of best managed state and best state for business and all these other things we won. The one thing I don't cite is that we fixed Virginia's transportation problems while I was in that job. But it is a real joy to be here, and also to commend once again the Mercatus Center and all the good work at George Mason on this very, very important topic in terms of regulations in the 21st century. I hope, and I've got great formal remarks here that I'm going to kind of try to speed through so we can get to a point of question and answers. But I hope, as most of the current focus right now is on the questions of CRs and budget resolutions and what we're going to do to kind of keep the government running over this the balance of the fiscal year. One of the areas that I have been spending much more of my time, and it ties at least indirectly into this question about regulations in the 21st century, which is, I hope in our desire to get through the balance of the fiscal year, we don't also miss the opportunity to recognize that there may be a moment in time here to look at our overall deficit and debt on a much broader basis. And I don't want to overly predict here, but I think there is a real growing recognition from members in both parties, at least in the Senate, that if we continue to focus the debate on the 12% of non-defense domestic discretionary spending, we're never going to get out of there. And that importance in terms of the long-term future of our country is to make sure that we get that deficit and debt under control, and that it's going to require putting everything on the table. It's going to require tax reform policy, it's going to require entitlements, it's going to require defense. And it's critically important in terms of getting our balance sheet in place, but it's also critically important if we're going to continue to grow our economy and stay competitive in a global sense. And that ties directly into the subject of today's sessions. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, regulations directly affect the competitiveness of America vis-a-vis the other nations in the world. And thinking about competitiveness from a multi-pronged front, from the fact that we've got to grow our economy, we've got to get our balance sheet in order, and regulations tie into that competitiveness strategy. Too often we think about competitiveness in terms of simply what we can do in terms of innovation, what we can do in terms of flow of capital, what we can do in terms of public and private sector investment. But more and more often in our 21st century economy, regulations play a critical role in terms of evaluating America's competitiveness. And frankly, if we are looking at recent international rankings, when you see one of the things that kind of should be more shocking, and I don't think a lot of my colleagues on either side of the aisle fully recognize, is that America has fallen from 4th to 5th in terms of international competitiveness rankings, and remarkably, the country that passed us was the UK. The UK, and I look around this room, there are some folks in there here that are my age. I kind of grew up with the idea that old England was the epitome of bureaucracy and regulations, where in a sense that one of the reasons that the UK has passed the United States in terms of international competitiveness is that both under the Labour government and under the Conservative government, regulatory reform has been a focus for the last 4 or 5 years. Something that has not really been, I think, of enough focus here in this country. Now, the challenge is going to be, how do we, whether it's deficit, whether it's competitiveness, or whether it's regulation, and we may have some spirited discussion on this, find some middle ground. We've got these kind of caricatures of the partisan positions, which are, Democrats have never seen an economic activity anywhere that wouldn't be helped by a little more regulation. And my Republican colleagues with the kind of folk that regulations per se are evil and consequently need to be eliminated. I think that's kind of simplistic approach on both sides is not where we're going to find not just common ground, but appropriate ground to move forward. I was involved very involved last year in a piece of legislation that I'm sure has caused some consternation in this room, and the Dodd-Frank bill, financial reform. We have many times after the fact focused on in certain areas where there was excessive regulation, and let me acknowledge there were parts of Dodd-Frank that put in place way too much regulation, although I'm quick to remind some of my colleagues in the financial industry that some of that regulation was because the financial industry itself came and begged us in Congress, please don't you guys decide, give it to the regulators. But there was also, I think at times, a failure to acknowledge that, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, there were clearly areas in terms of a level of financial products that had been created, that had been sold to the American public and the world public, that this was about lowering the price of risk, when in reality they created a financial house of cards, and not having some level of appropriate oversight for some of those financial products was not something, at least at the beginning of the debate, that anybody would have disagreed with. So some level of appropriate regulation, but that realizes it has to be put in the frame of overall world competitiveness, has to be a greater focus of policymaking. Let me come back also as I kind of get into the meat of what I want to talk about. Another marker that came down this week that I think again ties into our subject, and that was the GAO report that talked about policy overlap. I salute Senator Coburn for pushing this report. This is an area that I focused on as governor. This is an area where we've had there was a little piece of legislation we got through last year that I actually think could be the littlest, most important new law that nobody's ever heard of, and that was the GIPRA bill that in terms of government performance and metrics. And the reason I raise it now was, as you may have seen from the GAO report, it pointed out 82 separate programs where there was enormous overlap. I think there were 82 separate programs, for example, alone on teacher evaluation. I remember as a governor the enormous amount of federal government overlap in terms of workforce training, area after area where we can find through consolidation financial savings, stretching the taxpayer dollar, and I would argue are ripe for areas when you have dramatic program overlap, you've also got dramatic regulatory overlap. If you've got 17 different programs dealing with food safety, each of those programs setting forth their own set of regulatory burdens, this is going to add to excessive regulation and is going to compound the problem in terms of both inefficient allocation of government resources, but also inefficiencies in terms of how private business has to compete. So program overlap and regulatory overlap is an area that I don't think has received enough attention, and the GAO report should give us some guidance there. I mentioned the GIPRA bill only because one of the pieces of that legislation required, for the first time ever, and well, this is the point that didn't get a lot of attention, that every agency has to identify not only their top performing programs, but actually their least performing programs. If we're ever going to get towards program elimination, program consolidation, to simply leave that with OMB or outsiders without actually trying to engage the agencies themselves in that evaluation, that combined with the GAO study could be, I think, a very valuable and important tool going forward. Now, to the kind of the meat, regulatory review. One of the things that has struck me, and I preface this again, as was mentioned in the outset, I was co-founder of Nextel. I was a venture capitalist for 20 plus years. I still lay the claim I was much longer a business guy than I've been an elected official, which I think hopefully keeps me with the right perspective. But one of the things that I think that we, and I understand that one of the previous speakers already may have keyed this up, part of our regulatory review process has to be, how do we get the incentives right? How do we get the incentives right, not only from a policy-making standpoint, but how do we get the incentives right inside an agency with regulatory rulemaking responsibility? Right now, there is no incentive for an agency to ever eliminate or consolidate regulations. If anything, we have perverse incentives in place that actually say to an agency, if you make more regulations, if you add more challenges, you are at least indirectly rewarded with more public dollars, more attention, and more focus. And that, if we're trying to say we need a balance, and that if we're trying to say we need to try to get this right in terms of balancing the overall public goals and still remain competitive, the incentives aren't there and they aren't appropriately aligned. As well as the fact that while we have had momentarily blips over the last 20 years from both Democrats and Republicans alike, but those blips have never had real legs, where has there been ever any real process to go back and clean up those regulations that have outlived their purpose, technology is bypassed, or the business practices have dramatically changed? One of the things we see in world-class companies today is the management technique, whether it's the Six Sigma or the whole notion of continuing process improvements. Could you think about, again, I'm from the technology business, but as we've seen kind of the evolution, IBM to Microsoft to Google to now Facebook, and then IBM kind of jump-starting again and coming back into the pack, if any business stayed in a kind of static position on their business processes or internal rules, they would be out of business. The corporate world is replete with examples of great companies that couldn't keep pace. Well, in a sense, that is what we do in government. We are additive. We never go back and look at clearing out the underbrush, getting rid of rules and regulations that don't make sense, and trying to reposition ourselves. So how do we get about changing that? And let me give my 2 seconds review on some of the other proposals out there. With apologies to advocates of particular ones, you'll have a chance to whack me on mine in a moment, but kind of how I see the landscape. One is there is a sense from some that, let's just go out and go for a moratorium. And particularly from some at this point, vis-a-vis the EPA or agencies that perhaps have gotten a little too vibrant these days. How is that for a politically correct term in this crowd in the age of YouTube? You know, what you say can and will be used against you. You know, moratorium has a great political appeal. It's simple, it's easy. Also, I think makes no sense to kind of objectively draw a bright line and say for a period of time we're going to stop regardless of scientific advancement, stop regardless of what has happened in the world in terms of accident or event, Gulf oil spill being prime, or because we're suddenly finding that the market or others have gotten way ahead of any of us in terms of understanding. Moratorium, I think, does not make sense, even though it's politically, I think, very attractive. I've also had a chance to spend some time looking at Senator Mint and Representative Davis's approach in terms of the REINS Act. I think it has more appeal, but in terms of putting a congressional check on the process and kind of forcing that review, but and I say this as a relatively new member of Congress, only been in for 2 years, I'm not sure bringing Congress fully into the process speeds up anything. And the notion that if we're trying to give, particularly for industry, predictability, it may lead to more delay, but I'm not sure a thorough, full-fledged congressional approval process on every major regulation gets us to where we need to be in terms of economic predictability and really a much more rational process. I'm more intrigued with Representative Young's approach on independent data and sunsets. The sunset approach has been used at times in the past. It's kind of ebbs and flows in terms of sunsets on regulations, sunsets on laws. To my knowledge, and again, there's more knowledge in this room on this subject, there's a lot of efforts around sunsetting laws and regulations. They never seem to have really played out that well. I do think there is a sense of, though, and this is part of the REINS Act and part of Congressman Young's approach, which is the idea of at least giving Congress, while not a full check, some independent data and some independent kind of baseline approach to kind of beyond OIRA, how do we kind of figure out what the cost and benefits of certain regulations are, is an important tool. So let me get to where I'm coming from. When we started thinking about this, and Susan and others, there's a series of folks I want to thank who've been helping us think this through, has said, how do we accomplish, what are our goals? One is, a goal was to try to get those incentives aligned correctly. How do we make sure that an agency that is tasked with a public purpose, whether it's protecting the public or evaluating safety or efficacy, thinks about that public purpose in a way that has to make some cost-benefit analysis and has an incentive to say, how do we accomplish the goal? But if we can get 97% of the goal for 50% of the cost, they'll think about that seriously as opposed to getting 99% with 130% of the cost. So incentive alignment was one goal. Secondly, how do we get a goal? How do we get a broad stated policy goal that would actually put a process in place that would effectively go about trying to clean out some of the regulations that have been put in place in the past that have either outlived their usefulness, that have, that technology is transformed by, or even if the industry is accepted as kind of common practice, that may, in a greater scheme, be useful for elimination or consolidation. So, and also, how do we do something that at least at a conceptual level doesn't immediately, that has some appeal, beyond a Mercatus regulation policy crowd? How do we get this in a way that my fellow policymakers can understand and translate and not have their eyes glaze over in 30 seconds? So what we worked on was a concept. It was pretty simple. Regulatory pay-go. If you, in a particular regulatory area, an agency is tasked with adding a new regulation, that agency has to make the evaluation and cost-benefit analysis, and at the same time, because you're in effect setting a regulatory baseline, you're not doing a full regulatory budget, but if you're adding a regulation, you have to take one away. Now, simple concept. The pay-go concept is obviously very familiar on Capitol Hill, even if it has a few holes in it at this point. But we thought, could we push forward on this area? We thought as well that if we were moving forward on this area, to try this for a 3 or 5 year period would be something of, might have some broader bipartisan appeal, in the sense that it would, for that 3 to 5 year period, really become effective at clearing out some of the underbrush in the past. As well, by moving forward with this process, it would require a much greater kind of cost-benefit analysis, because you'd have to set a baseline. There are clearly some challenges in this, whereby, if you take one away in an area, it has to be relatively within the same scope. You can't add a new environmental regulation and take away a regulation in food safety, and you can't, this can be carried to the extreme that says, you can't have a process that would say, okay, we're going to add a new regulation on salmonella and take one away on mad cow disease. You have to have some level of congressional check on an expedited process at the end of the year that would kind of bless this, so you don't have the agencies running amok. But before anyone in the crowd, and again, this is a group that is probably familiar with this, says, well, this is just too hard to do and can't be done, let me go back to my example of where we stand on competitiveness. The UK has actually implemented regulatory pay-go. Now, they call it the one in, one out approach, and by no means is have they completely solved it. But what they have found so far, and I've had some conversations with our friends in the UK, is that what they have done is they have found that agencies that have put forward regulations, if they originally came forward with a regulation that was going to cost an industry 150 million pounds, and the agency has then found that they've got to take something away of 150 pounds worth of value, they found time and again that at the end of the day they can end up with a regulation that still accomplishes that public purpose, but it gets wheedled back to suddenly where it might be a 20 or 30 million pound cost benefit. And it may not be to the perfection of some of the advocates on the regulatory side, but it ends up accomplishing the purpose in a way that makes the UK more competitive. And I close with that fact again. The proof's in the pudding. Independent validation puts the UK ahead of us in terms of international competitiveness. That is something that has to be kind of our overarching goal in regulatory review and regulations in the 21st century forum. This is an idea, regulatory pay-go, that I hope will get some support and pushback from this crowd and others. We are working through kind of the second and third layer of detail on this, and I think it should be part of the debate, and I'm looking forward to working with my friends at Mercatus and others in this area to try to get it right. So with that, I'm happy to have been here. I know I've gone beyond my time, and I know we've got the congressman coming afterwards, but I'd be more than happy to take a couple questions.
One question, and there's Dan Claybaugh's back there, so if you just raise your hand, he'll bring you a microphone. Dan, this one's terrific.
Well, I've got kind of a loud voice.
Okay. Well, we'd like to get you on tape, though, so. You just tell us who you are and ask your question briefly.
Hi, Senator. My name's Brett McMahon. I'm actually a local concrete contractor, but I'm deeply interested in this kind of thing. In the District of Columbia, there is a financial control board in waiting. essentially. Once they pass a certain threshold, a financial control board goes into effect. I preface this question in that way by saying, is it actually reasonable to expect that agencies will be able to self-regulate in terms of their output and things like that, if in fact those agencies are, in essence, eternal? In other words, the incentive for them to actually become so onerous on the economy doesn't really affect them because the agency itself is not going away. Maybe their output decreases, but unless there's actually a way to say, you know what, you've actually, as an agency, outlived your usefulness, or we need to replace you with something like this DC Financial Control Board in waiting. Unless that exists, how can you possibly incentivize an agency to stop output?
A couple of thoughts on that. One is the premise there, I think, is that the agency's purpose and usefulness has kind of outlived its time. I think you're right that no agency is going to immediately say, okay, we're done, stick a fork in us. I've not at least ever seen that happen so far in government. But I'm not sure. I need to think through, and if the Financial Control Board in waiting doesn't eliminate the agency, it just says if you kind of overdo, you're going to have another regulatory body take place, at least my understanding is. I still think that is ultimately the responsibility kind of the executive or the legislative branch, and the president has put in place this idea that we're going to look at consolidation, we're going to look at regulatory review, although I think we need some more teeth. That's why I'm trying to get this balance right. So I think that should ultimately still be the legislators or the executive's responsibility, number one. Number two, I will emphasize, one of the things I tried to do last year, didn't get a lot of attention, was I said, well, and I've done this as governor, actually eliminate programs. It's not just agencies. Tell me what every politician likes to come and be at the ribbon cutting or the photo op when you announce a new program that's going to solve some problem. When was the last time you ever had a politician show up when we said we're actually going to close the doors of a particular program? It doesn't happen. And I took last year, tried to take at least the lowest hanging fruit. I took those programs that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration ought to have agreed on an elimination. There were only 16 of them, 17 of them, there was only $1 billion, but $1 billion here, $1 billion there, who's talking about money? And we kind of couldn't get there. I do think there may be a moment in time right now as the issues around the deficit come up, this GAO study, the GIP report portion last year, where we could see at least program elimination. On regulatory elimination, I don't know how we get there agency alone. I think it's the legislator's responsibility, but I do think you will. Our PAYGO approach says you at least put a check. If you're adding something, that you got to take something away, you will at least have the agency as a participant thinking, oh my gosh, which ones, if we got to really add something, which ones really have outlived its usefulness, and they will be at least incentive to try to find and help clear us out some of the regulations that have outlived their usefulness. Getting them in the game is what I'm trying to do. A lot of the other things, whether you leave it with Congress or moratorium or a simple sunset provision, I think the agencies have to be kind of in the mix on their incentives. Not a perfect solution, but it's.
Thanks, Senator Warner.
Thank you all very much.